the 17th of February 1951, Hill 440, Central Korea, 0547 hours. The morning arrived without mercy. Frost clung to the blackened earth like a second skin, and the wind carried the bitter smell of cordite and pine resin. In the valleys below, the Imjin River twisted through terrain that had seen blood spilled by Chinese dynasties, Japanese occupation forces, and now, in this frozen corner of hell, men who spoke English and men who spoke Mandarin. The ridge rose steep and unforgiving, terraced with bunkers carved into frozen soil, reinforced with logs and sandbags that had turned to concrete under the relentless cold. Inside those earthen wounds, soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army huddled in quilted uniforms, their breath forming clouds in the dark. They had been told the Americans were soft. They had been told the Americans would break. They had not been told about the dragon. It came low, hugging the contours of the hill, its twin engines roaring like some industrial animal escaped from a factory floor. The shape was ugly, utilitarian, a broad fuselage, a canopy bulging with glass, wings stubby and loaded with tanks that gleamed dull silver in the early light. The Chinese soldiers had seen aircraft before. They had endured bombings, strafings, the distant thunder of B-29 seconds turning cities into ash. But this was different. This machine flew slow, almost leisurely, as if it had all the time in the world, as if it owned the sky. The nose dipped slightly, and from beneath the aircraft's belly, something spilled forth a liquid shadow that caught the light and shimmered, almost beautiful, as it arced toward the ridge. Then the world caught fire. Flame erupted across the hillside in a single, continuous wave. Not the brief flash of explosives or the crackling fingers of napalm bombs, but a rolling, breathing inferno that clung to earth and flesh alike. The fire did not merely burn, it consumed. It poured into bunkers like molten judgment, turning ventilation slits into chimneys that roared with superheated air. Men screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the deeper roar of combustion. Trees that had stood for decades became torches in seconds. The snow itself seemed to burn, sublimating into steam that mixed with black smoke, creating a fog of annihilation that obscured everything except the red-orange heart of the fire. The aircraft pulled up gently, banked to the right, and circled back for another pass. Inside the cockpit, the pilot toggled switches with practiced efficiency, his face illuminated by instrument lights, his voice calm on the radio as he called in coordinates. Behind him, the ridge continued to burn, and in the valleys beyond, other pilots watched and learned and understood what they had just witnessed. The arrival of a weapon that would redefine close air support, that would turn the tide of battles not through precision or elegance, but through sheer, unrelenting volume of destruction. They had called it the Flying Zippo. The nickname was meant as mockery, born in the engineering halls and test ranges where men with clipboards watched the ungainly aircraft lumber through maneuvers. Zippo, like the cigarette lighter, cheap and simple and utilitarian. But mockery has a way of transforming into myth when soaked in fire and blood. By the time the Korean War ground to its bitter stalemate in 1953, the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar, converted into a gunship, later formalized as the AC-119 program, but spiritually born in those early napalm missions, had become something else entirely. It had become the thing that haunted ridgelines, the machine that turned defensive positions into crematoriums, the weapon that made men pray for clouds. This is the story of how a lumbering transport aircraft, derided and doubted, became an instrument of total destruction. This is the story of the Flying Zippo. The Second World War had ended with fire. Atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, certainly, but also the more conventional fires that had consumed Dresden and Tokyo, Hamburg and Manila. The strategic bombing campaigns had demonstrated something profound and terrible about modern warfare. That fire, when applied with industrial efficiency, could achieve what bullets and shells could not. It could break morale. It could render cities uninhabitable. It could make surrender seem like salvation rather than defeat. But Korea was different. Korea was not about burning cities. It was about hills and ridges, about bunkers dug deep into frozen earth, about an enemy who had learned from the Japanese that the best defense against American firepower was to go underground. The Chinese and North Korean forces excelled at this. They built warrens that could withstand direct artillery hits. They learned to move at night, to disperse during the day, to present no targets worth the expenditure of bombs. American commanders found themselves frustrated by an enemy who refused to stand still, who melted into the landscape, who emerged only to attack and then vanished again into tunnels and caves. Traditional close air support had its limitations. Fighter bombers like the F-51 Mustang and F-80 Shooting Star were fast and deadly, but they were also expensive and fleeting. They made one pass, dropped their ordnance, and were gone, fuel tanks emptying, the clock always ticking. They could strike with precision, but they could not linger. They could not provide the sustained pressure needed to suppress an enemy dug deep and determined to wait out the storm. The military mind, when confronted with a problem, tends to look first at what it already has. In 1951, what the United States had in abundance was transport aircraft. The Korean War's logistics demanded a constant aerial pipeline supplies, ammunition, reinforcements, evacuations. The C-119 flying boxcar was one of the workhorses of this effort, a twin-boom cargo hauler designed to carry trucks and artillery pieces and paratroopers. It was large, slow, and by fighter pilot standards spectacularly unglamorous. It had a cruising speed of 200 miles per hour. It could not dogfight. It could not evade enemy fighters without escort. But it could carry weight, and it could fly low, and it could remain on station for hours. Someone, and history has lost the precise name in the bureaucratic fog of war, asked a question that seemed almost perverse. What if we turned a cargo plane into a weapon? The idea was not entirely new. The Germans had experimented with gunships during the Second World War, mounting cannons on Ju-52 transports for ground attack roles. The concept had shown promise but had been abandoned in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The Americans, with their characteristic faith in technological solutions, revisited the concept with modifications suited to the Korean theater. If the enemy was underground, you did not need precision bombs. You needed something that could sterilize the surface, that could make the earth itself uninhabitable. You needed fire, sustained and inescapable. The initial conversions were crude. Existing Cone 119 seconds were fitted with racks designed to carry napalm canisters, not to drop them, but to pour them. Valves and pumps allowed the napalm to be dispensed in a continuous stream, ignited by a device mounted beneath the fuselage. The result was not a bomb or a rocket, but something closer to a flamethrower mounted on an aircraft. The crew could control the flow, adjusting the intensity and duration, painting entire hillsides with liquid fire. The first test missions were flown with skepticism. Pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of jet fighters looked at the C-119 and saw a flying coffin, slow, vulnerable, a target waiting to happen. The nickname Flying Zippo emerged during these early trials, and it was not spoken with affection. But nicknames, like prophecies, sometimes contain truths that only reveal themselves in retrospect. On Hill 440, the Chinese defensive position had been carefully prepared. The soldiers who occupied it were veterans of the Chinese Civil War, men who had marched across provinces and survived nationalist artillery. They had been lectured by political officers about American decadence, about soldiers who needed hot meals and soft beds, who would crumble when faced with hardship and revolutionary fervor. Some believed this. Others simply believed in survival, in the camaraderie of their units, in the hope that if they held this hill, if they killed enough Americans, perhaps the war would end and they could go home. They had watched American aircraft before the silver glints of bombers at high altitude, the swooping fighter bombers that came and went like angry hornets. They had learned the rhythms of airstrikes. You heard the engines, you dove into your bunker, you covered your head, and you waited for the explosions. Then you emerged, checked your weapon, and resumed your position. It was terrifying, but it was survivable. The C-119 that approached Hill 440 that February morning did not follow those rhythms. It flew too low, too slow. Some of the Chinese soldiers actually laughed, a rare sound in those grim weeks. The aircraft looked like it was struggling, like it might stall and crash before it reached their position. One soldier, whose name survives in Chinese military archives as Private Chen Wei, reportedly said to his squadmate, "They send their cargo planes now? Do they have no fighters left?" The laughter stopped when the fire began. Napalm, in 1951, was a refined horror. The original napalm used in World War II had been a mixture of naphthenate and palmitate, hence the name combined with gasoline, to create a gel that stuck to surfaces and burned intensely. By Korea, the formula had evolved. The addition of polystyrene made the mixture even more adhesive, even harder to extinguish. It burned at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It consumed oxygen so rapidly that even those not directly touched by flame could suffocate in the thermal vacuum it created. When dispensed from an aircraft in a continuous stream, napalm did not fall in discrete bomb patterns. It spread like a living thing, following terrain contours, pouring into depressions, seeping into bunker entrances. The C-119's delivery system allowed pilots to lay down a carpet of fire that could cover an area the size of several football fields in a single pass. And because the aircraft could fly slowly, because it could make multiple passes, it could saturate a target with a thoroughness that no fighter bomber could match. The flames on Hill 440 reached into bunkers that artillery had failed to crack. The heat was so intense that wooden support beams ignited from the inside, collapsing tunnels and trapping men who had thought themselves safe underground. Those who fled into the open found no sanctuary. The entire hillside was burning, and the smoke was so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Men stumbled blindly, their lungs searing with each breath, their quilted uniforms igniting like paper. The Chinese unit defending Hill 440 numbered approximately 300 men before the attack. After 3 passes by the C-119, fewer than 40 were able to retreat. The rest were dead or so badly burned that they died within hours. The hill itself was left scorched black, stripped of vegetation, the earth itself cracked and steaming. American infantry who advanced to secure the position later that day reported that the smell was unbearable, not just smoke, but burned flesh and melted rubber and something else, something chemical and wrong that clung to their uniforms for days. The engagement was noted in tactical reports with clinical brevity. Close air support, effective. Enemy resistance neutralized. But the pilots who flew those missions, and the ground troops who witnessed the aftermath, carried different reports. They spoke in mess halls and barracks, in letters home that were censored, but still conveyed the essential truth. There was a new weapon in the war, and it was like nothing anyone had seen before. The German soldiers who had faced American flamethrowers in the bunkers of Normandy and the Siegfried Line had understood, on a visceral level, the psychological power of fire as a weapon. Fire is primal. It reaches past training and ideology straight into the animal brain that fears heat and light and the dissolution of self that burning represents. But those flamethrowers had range measured in yards. The Flying Zippo had range measured in miles, and it could orbit overhead like a mechanical vulture, waiting for targets to present themselves. Intelligence reports captured after the war, from Chinese and North Korean sources, reveal the impact this weapon had on enemy morale. One document, translated from Mandarin and now housed in the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, contains testimony from a Chinese platoon leader. "We were told that American soldiers were cowards who relied on machines. But the machines were enough. When the fireplane came, men who had held against artillery, who had charged American positions at night, broke and ran. You cannot fight fire with courage. You cannot dig deep enough to escape it." This was the transformation the weapon engineers in 1951 had sought but perhaps not fully understood they would achieve. The Flying Zippo did not merely destroy enemy positions, it destroyed the enemy's will to occupy positions. Hills and ridges that had been contested for weeks could be cleared in hours. Bunker complexes that would have required costly infantry assaults could be rendered uninhabitable without a single American soldier setting foot on the ground. But there was a cost, beyond the logistical expense of napalm and aircraft maintenance. The crews who flew these missions were not fighter jocks with their glamorous scarves and cocky attitudes. They were transport pilots, cargo haulers, men who had signed up to ferry supplies and had found themselves transformed into dispensers of apocalypse. They flew low and slow over hostile terrain, vulnerable to ground fire, entirely dependent on fighter escorts to keep enemy aircraft at bay. And they flew in the knowledge of what they were doing, of what their missions meant. One pilot, whose account was recorded decades later for an oral history project, described the experience. You'd make your approach, and you'd see them down there, little figures running, trying to get away, and you'd think, just for a second, about how scared they must be. And then you'd think about your buddy who got hit by mortar fire last week, about the ambush that wiped out a patrol, and you'd flip the switch. The first time, it made me sick. The 10th time, it was just a job. This moral duality would haunt the napalm campaigns of Korea and, later, Vietnam. The weapon was effective precisely because it was indiscriminate, because it turned terrain into death traps regardless of who occupied them. American commanders praised its efficiency. International observers and, eventually, historians would condemn its brutality. But in February 1951, on hills whose names were known only by numbers on maps, such debates seemed distant and abstract compared to the immediate reality of war. The napalm itself became a kind of symbol not just of American firepower, but of American industrial capacity. Each canister represented a supply chain that stretched back across the Pacific to factories in California and Texas, to chemical plants that produced the polystyrene, to refineries that processed the gasoline. The sheer abundance of it was staggering to an enemy that struggled to keep its soldiers fed. Chinese troops in Korea often subsisted on millet and whatever they could forage. Their ammunition was rationed. Their artillery support was sporadic. And then they would watch American aircraft drop or dispense napalm with what seemed like casual extravagance, coating entire hillsides in a substance that cost more to produce than many Chinese soldiers would earn in a year. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an economic system that had emerged from World War II as the dominant industrial power on the planet. While Europe rebuilt from rubble and China struggled to consolidate its revolution, American factories were producing not just weapons, but the vast logistical infrastructure to deliver those weapons anywhere in the world. The C-119. Flying boxcar itself was a product of this system mass-produced, with hundreds rolling off assembly lines, enough that losing a few to enemy action or mechanical failure was considered acceptable. To the Chinese soldier shivering in his bunker, this abundance must have seemed almost supernatural. How could one nation produce so much, so easily? The propaganda he had been fed about American decadence suddenly took on a different meaning. Perhaps the Americans were soft in some ways, but they had translated that softness, that desire for comfort and efficiency, into a war machine that could afford to burn entire landscapes just to clear a single ridge. Soviet advisors who observed the Korean War took careful notes. The effectiveness of American air power, and particularly the use of incendiary weapons, influenced Soviet military doctrine for decades. It became axiomatic in Soviet planning that any future conflict with the United States would require air superiority above all else, because American willingness and ability to apply overwhelming firepower from the air was unmatched. As the Korean War ground on through 1951 and 1952, the Flying Zippo missions became more sophisticated. Tactics evolved. Pilots learned to coordinate with forward air controllers, to arrive over targets at precise moments to support infantry advances or to cut off enemy retreats. The aircraft were modified, with better navigation equipment, improved fire suppression systems to prevent the napalm from accidentally igniting inside the aircraft, and eventually, experimental weapons like early cluster munitions and white phosphorus markers. But the core mission remained unchanged: to burn to deny the enemy the ability to hide, to fortify, to feel safe anywhere American aircraft could reach. The psychological impact of this constant threat was perhaps as important as the physical damage inflicted. Enemy soldiers had to live with the knowledge that at any moment, without warning beyond the distant drone of engines, fire could rain down and turn their position into an inferno. There were failures, of course. Cone 119 seconds were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Missions went awry due to weather, or mechanical failures, or simple human error. In one documented incident, a napalm dispenser malfunctioned and coated the aircraft's own tail section in burning gel. The crew managed to land safely, but the plane was a total loss. These setbacks were noted, analyzed, and incorporated into training. The weapon system improved because it was tested constantly, refined in the crucible of actual combat. By 1953, as armistice negotiations finally produced a ceasefire, the lessons learned from the napalm campaigns were being codified into doctrine. The Air Force had recognized that the future of close air support lay not just in fast jets with precision weapons, but in platforms that could provide sustained fire, that could orbit over a battlefield and bring immediate, overwhelming force to bear. This doctrine would culminate in the AC-130 gunship program during the Vietnam War, a direct descendant of the Flying Zippo concept, but armed with cannons and sensors that turned night into day. The Korean War napalm campaigns remained classified for years, their full scope hidden behind the operational security of ongoing Cold War tensions. But veterans knew. The men who had called in those strikes, who had watched hills burn, carried the memory. And occasionally, in interviews or memoirs, fragments of the truth would emerge. There is a photograph, grainy and faded, housed in the National Archives. It shows Hill 440 approximately 1 week after the napalm strike. The earth is black. Not the brown black of scorched soil, but a deep, charcoal black that looks almost artificial. No vegetation is visible. The bunkers have collapsed into themselves, creating craters that look like impact sites, but were actually caused by internal combustion. In the foreground, barely visible, is what might be a helmet or a piece of equipment. The photo's resolution is too poor to tell. This photograph was included in a tactical assessment report titled Effectiveness of Incendiary Weapons in Prepared Defensive Positions. The report's conclusions were blunt. Napalm dispensed from low-flying aircraft was more effective than conventional high-explosive bombs at neutralizing entrenched enemy forces in a ratio of approximately 3-to-1, meaning 1 napalm mission achieved what 3 conventional bombing missions could accomplish. The cost-effectiveness was even more favorable when factoring in the reduced risk to ground troops who would otherwise have to assault such positions. But cost-effectiveness is a cold way to measure what happened on hills like 440. The men who burned there had names, families, dreams that died with them. They had been soldiers in an army that asked them to hold positions against impossible odds, that told them sacrifice was glorious and necessary. They believed, or tried to believe, or at least obeyed. And they died in fire because another army, wealthier and more industrialized, had found an efficient way to kill without risking its own soldiers. This is not to absolve or condemn, but simply to observe. The Flying Zippo represented a certain American approach to warfare, one that prioritized technological solutions over human risk, that sought to make war less costly for Americans by making it exponentially more costly for the enemy. This approach had moral implications that strategists in 1951 were only beginning to grapple with, implications that would become impossible to ignore in later decades. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army adapted, as armies do. They dispersed their forces more widely, making concentrations less vulnerable to area weapons. They improved their anti-aircraft capabilities, making low-flying aircraft more dangerous to operate. They dug deeper, built better ventilation systems, learned to identify the sound of C-119 engines and take cover immediately. But adaptation has limits. You cannot adapt your way out of fire when fire is applied with sufficient intensity and persistence. The best Chinese units could hope for was to minimize casualties, to accept that some positions would have to be abandoned when the fireplanes came, to focus their defense on areas where terrain or weather made air operations difficult. This forced a kind of strategic recalculation. The Chinese command had initially believed that superior numbers and willingness to accept casualties would eventually overwhelm American forces. The casualty ratios in human terms favored this belief. Chinese forces suffered far higher casualties than American forces throughout the war. But when those casualties included entire units immolated on hillsides, when veteran soldiers who had survived the long march died screaming in napalm fires, the calculus changed. The war became about holding enough terrain to claim victory at the negotiating table, not about destroying the American army in the field. The armistice signed in July 1953 essentially froze the front lines where they stood. No clear victor emerged in the conventional sense. But the American military's ability to project firepower, to make any position untenable through air power alone, had fundamentally shaped the war's outcome. The Flying Zippo and weapons like it had proven that in modern warfare, the side with air superiority and industrial abundance could dictate the terms of battle. In the years after Korea, the pilots and crew who had flown napalm missions scattered to other assignments, other wars, or civilian life. Some spoke openly about their experiences, others carried the memories in silence. The aircraft themselves, the Cone 119 seconds that had been converted into fire dispensers, were mostly returned to transport duties or retired to boneyards in the Arizona desert. But the concept survived and evolved. The AC-130 gunship that prowled the skies over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a more sophisticated machine, armed with cannons and sensors, but it was spiritually descended from those early Korean War experiments. It served the same purpose: to provide sustained, overwhelming fire support, to make the night deadly for any enemy who moved, to turn the sky into a platform for annihilation. The nickname Flying Zippo faded from official use but persisted in veteran slang. In bars near military bases, old men who had been young pilots in Korea would sometimes tell stories about the Zippo, and younger servicemen would listen with a mixture of awe and unease. The stories had a quality of myth, of events too extreme to be fully believed, even though they were documented in archives and after-action reports. One such story, repeated in various forms, told of a Chinese position that had held against ground assaults for 2 weeks, inflicting heavy casualties on American and South Korean forces. The ridge was honeycombed with bunkers, and every attempt to advance was met with devastating machine gun and mortar fire. Artillery barrages barely scratched the fortifications. The divisional commander, frustrated and aware that time was running out before the spring offensive, requested air support. Not the usual fighter-bomber strikes, but something more sustained. A flight of Cone 119 seconds arrived at dawn. They made 5 passes over the ridge, each pass laying down a river of napalm that flowed across the hillside like molten metal. The fire burned so hot that rocks cracked. The smoke column was visible from miles away. When the aircraft finally departed, the ridge was unrecognizable, a lunar landscape of ash and destruction. The infantry advanced, expecting resistance. They found none. The Chinese defenders had either burned or suffocated or fled. The bunkers were ovens. One sergeant, in a detail that appeared in multiple accounts, reported finding a row of Chinese soldiers who had died sitting against a bunker wall, far from any flames. They had suffocated when the fire consumed all the oxygen in their section of tunnel. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene. They looked like they had simply fallen asleep. This image, the sleeping dead, killed by a weapon they never saw, in a bunker they thought was safe, became emblematic of what the Flying Zippo represented. It was death at a distance, industrialized and efficient, severed from the visceral reality of combat. The pilot who dispensed the napalm never saw the faces of his victims. The infantry who occupied the position afterward saw only the aftermath, not the act itself. War had always been about killing, but this felt different, more clinical, more absolute. There is a philosophical question that haunts weapons of this nature. Does efficiency in killing reduce suffering, or does it simply enable more killing? The Flying Zippo could clear a ridge in minutes that might have taken days of bloody infantry combat to secure. In that sense, it saved American lives and shortened battles. But it also made battles possible that might otherwise have been deemed too costly. Commanders could order attacks on positions they would never have attempted if the only option was sending men with rifles up a hill. This calculus trading enemy lives for time and American lives became central to American military strategy during the Cold War. It was predicated on technological superiority and industrial capacity. As long as America could produce more weapons, more fuel, more napalm than its enemies could withstand, then the logic held. But the logic required accepting that war would be waged with weapons that made no distinction between combatants who wanted to surrender and combatants who would fight to the death, between enemy soldiers and anyone unlucky enough to be in the target zone. International humanitarian law, still evolving in the 1950s, struggled to address weapons like napalm. Was it more or less humane than conventional explosives? Did it cause unnecessary suffering, or was it simply more effective? The debate continued in academic journals and international conferences, while on hillsides in Korea, the practical application rendered the debate moot. The weapon existed, it worked, and it would be used. Decades later, researchers interviewing Korean War veterans from various nations found patterns in how men remembered fire weapons versus conventional weapons. Soldiers who had survived artillery barrages spoke of terror and chaos, of noise and concussion, of randomness. You lived or died based on where you happened to be when the shells landed. Soldiers who had survived napalm attacks spoke differently. They spoke of inevitability, of fire that followed you, that found you even in cover. They spoke of the smell not just burning, but something worse, something that clung to memory long after the physical scars had healed. One Chinese veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, described his experience on a hill that had been hit by napalm. "I was in a deep bunker. I should have been safe. But the fire, it sucked the air out. I could not breathe. My lungs burned, and I had not even seen flames. I crawled to the entrance, and the world outside was orange and black. I thought I had died and this was hell. I ran into the fire because staying in the bunker meant suffocating. I do not remember how I escaped. I woke up in a hospital weeks later. They told me I was lucky. I did not feel lucky." This testimony, and hundreds like it, provide a glimpse into the human cost obscured by tactical reports and casualty statistics. War, even when documented extensively, remains fundamentally a collection of individual experiences of terror and survival. The Flying Zippo inflicted both in measure, difficult to quantify but impossible to forget for those who endured it. The symbolic power of the Zippo lighter itself is worth examining. The Zippo Manufacturing Company, founded in 1932 inches, Bradford, Pennsylvania, had become synonymous with reliable fire. Their windproof lighters were carried by millions of American soldiers during World War II and Korea. GIs used them to light cigarettes in foxholes, to heat rations, to provide a moment of normalcy in chaos. The lighter was a tool of comfort, of small pleasures stolen from war. To name a weapon after this object, to call an aircraft that dispensed death by fire a Zippo was a dark joke, the kind of gallows humor that soldiers used to cope with the incomprehensible. But it was also fitting. The Zippo lighter worked reliably, every time. It was simple, utilitarian, unglamorous. These were the same qualities that made the C-119 napalm dispenser effective. It was not beautiful or sophisticated. It simply worked. American soldiers in Korea often carried Zippo lighters with engravings, unit insignia, girlfriends' names, countdown calendars, marking days until rotation home. These tiny metal objects became talismans, connections to a world beyond the war. And somewhere above, aircraft nicknamed after those same lighters were turning men into ash. The duality captures something essential about American warfare in the 20th century. The proximity of comfort and destruction, the way industrial capacity could produce both convenience and annihilation from the same system. By the time the armistice was signed, the Flying Zippo had flown hundreds of sorties, dispensed thousands of gallons of napalm, and contributed to the deaths of an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 enemy soldiers. The numbers are imprecise because fire destroys evidence, and bodies burned beyond recognition are difficult to count. These numbers appeared in classified assessments, in reports that weighed cost versus effectiveness, in analyses that tried to measure the immeasurable. But numbers alone cannot capture what the weapon meant, what it represented. It was a manifestation of American strategic culture, the belief that technology and resources could overcome any obstacle, that warfare could be made less costly for Americans through the application of superior firepower, that the goal was not to match the enemy man for man, but to create such an imbalance of capability that victory became inevitable. This approach had deep roots, stretching back to the Civil War's industrial campaigns, through World War I's material advantage to World War II's total mobilization. Korea confirmed the pattern and set it in stone for the conflicts to come. When American forces faced enemies in Vietnam, in the deserts of Iraq, in the mountains of Afghanistan, the same impulse would manifest. Use firepower to minimize American casualties, employ technology as a force multiplier, make the enemy's will to fight irrelevant by making the battlefield itself uninhabitable. The Flying Zippo was an early, crude expression of this philosophy. Later weapons would be more precise, more discriminating, guided by lasers and GPS and real-time intelligence. But the fundamental calculus remained. American lives were more valuable than enemy lives, and any weapon that protected the former by destroying the latter was worth developing and deploying. In the final months of the war, as both sides maneuvered for advantage at the negotiating table in Panmunjom, the napalm missions continued. Every hill gained or lost became a bargaining chip. The Chinese launched offensives designed to seize terrain before the ceasefire. American forces defended with artillery, air power, and the knowledge that holding a position no longer required winning a battle. It only required making that battle too costly for the enemy to sustain. One of the last major napalm strikes occurred in June 1953, less than 2 months before the armistice. A Chinese assault had briefly captured a hill known on American maps as Outpost Harry. Counterattacks were launched immediately, but the Chinese had reinforced heavily and were determined to hold. The battle raged for 3 days, with hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, artillery dueling over the hill's crest, casualties mounting on both sides. On the 3rd day, a flight of cone 119 seconds appeared. By this point in the war, Chinese troops knew what was coming. Some tried to retreat, others stayed in their bunkers, hoping the fortifications would hold. The napalm fell in sheets, and the hill became an inferno. American infantry advanced behind the fire, and the hill was retaken. The cost in Chinese lives was staggering. Estimates suggested more than 400 casualties, most from burns or suffocation. Outpost Harry had no strategic value. It was a hill like dozens of others, important only because it existed on the line of demarcation being negotiated at Panmunjom. The battle was fought, and the napalm was dropped, because neither side could afford to appear weak in the final days before peace. This is the logic of war carried to its absurd conclusion: killing for the sake of negotiating position, burning men alive to gain inches on a map that would soon be frozen by armistice lines. The pilots who flew that mission later reported that they received no special commendation, no acknowledgement beyond a line in a logbook. It was simply another mission, another target, another hill turned to ash. By June 1953, the Flying Zippo was no longer novel or surprising. It was routine. When the ceasefire finally took effect on the 27th of July, 1953, the front lines fell silent for the first time in 3 years. The hills and ridges that had seen so much blood and fire were left scarred, the earth itself bearing witness to what had transpired. In the decades since, those scars have faded. Vegetation returned. Rain washed away the ash. The bunkers collapsed or were filled in, but the people who were there, the soldiers on both sides, the pilots and crews, the civilians caught in the maelstrom, carried their own scars forward. The Korean War became known as the Forgotten War in American memory, overshadowed by World War II and Vietnam. But it was not forgotten by those who fought it, who saw what modern weapons could do, who understood that something fundamental had shifted in how wars would be fought. The Flying Zippo, that unglamorous cargo plane turned into a dispenser of apocalypse, became a footnote in military history. The AC-130 gunships that followed were more famous, more storied, but the lineage is clear. Every close air support aircraft that carries napalm or white phosphorus or thermobaric weapons is a descendant of those early C-119 conversions. Every doctrine that emphasizes overwhelming firepower over maneuver warfare owes something to the lessons learned on Korean ridges. And the nickname persists, in whispered stories and classified briefings, wherever military men gather to discuss the tools of their trade. The Flying Zippo. Mocked at first, feared by the end, remembered always. There is a memorial in South Korea, near the demilitarized zone, where visitors can look north across the border into terrain that has changed little since 1953. The hills roll away into the distance, green and peaceful, dotted with trees that have grown up in the intervening decades. It is difficult, standing there, to imagine those hills burning. It is difficult to reconcile the quiet beauty with the documented history of fire and death. But history is not about what is easy to imagine. It is about what happened, and why, and what it meant. The Flying Zippo happened because war demanded solutions, and American ingenuity provided one. It meant that a generation of soldiers learned to fear not just the enemy they could see, but the sky itself, which could at any moment pour down fire that made courage and fortifications equally irrelevant. And it symbolized a truth that has defined American military power ever since, that abundance, when weaponized, becomes a force more devastating than individual valor or tactical genius. The side that can afford to burn hillsides, to expend thousands of gallons of napalm on single positions, to replace lost aircraft and crews without hesitation, that side has an advantage that is nearly insurmountable. The Chinese soldiers who mocked the slow, ungainly cone, 119 inches the seconds before the fire fell, learned this truth in the worst possible way. The American commanders who ordered those missions learned it too, though their lesson was different. That power of this magnitude comes with responsibilities that cannot be shirked, questions that cannot be ignored, and consequences that ripple forward through decades. In the end, the Flying Zippo was retired not because it was ineffective, but because it was superseded. Better aircraft, better weapons, better targeting systems emerged. The age of precision warfare promised to make area weapons like napalm obsolete, though that promise has yet to be fully realized. But the aircraft itself, the actual cone 119 seconds that flew those missions, mostly ended their days in salvage yards, cut apart for scrap, their history lost to all but the most dedicated researchers. And yet the legacy endures. In military academies, where future officers study the Korean War, the napalm campaigns are analyzed for their tactical effectiveness. In international law conferences, they are cited in debates about proportionality and necessity in warfare. In veterans' halls and memorial services, they are remembered by men who saw the fire or delivered it, and who carried that knowledge into old age. The Flying Zippo burned a ridge clean in minutes, but it burned itself into history and memory with equal thoroughness, a machine that embodied both American innovation and American capacity for destruction, a weapon that was mocked until it was used, and feared forever after. This is what remains, not the aircraft which are gone, but the knowledge of what was done, what was possible, what happened when necessity and capability met on frozen hills half a world away. The fire has long since gone out, the smoke has dispersed, but the ashes remain, mixed into the soil, and the stories remain, passed down through generations of soldiers who know that war is never clean, never simple, and never without cost, even when victory is measured in minutes, and hills are cleared by fire from the sky.